Scientists just discovered a new crazy behavior in E. coli, and we're going to talk all about that today on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. It is I, as always, your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and the infamous, and that, of course, is the incredible and the amazing bacteria. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody had a wonderful Christmas and holiday break and had a totally relaxing time, ate all the cookies, had wonderful, wonderful time with family and friends. I'd like to welcome you guys back to the first episode of the new year. So many things in store for the new year. Very, very exciting stuff. And it feels appropriate that we start off by talking about bacteria. We're going to talk about actually a new characteristic, a new behavior that a bunch of researchers figured out with respect to the bacteria E. coli. We're going to talk about that in just one second. But first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, or if you're listening to this podcast on some other medium like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to hit that follow button to help support the channel and to help support the podcast, especially as we enter into a brand new year of bacteria and all such associated microorganisms. But anyway, enough of that. Let's jump into the sciencey stuff for the day. I guess the best way to kick this off would be to reiterate what we know about bacteria and the issues that they have with scale, right? Because bacteria, maybe we don't really think about this all that much, but bacteria are extremely, extremely small. There's only one that I can think of, maybe two types of bacteria that you can actually see the individual cells with the naked eye, but they're extremely, extremely small. Now, this actually causes some issues for bacteria because they're so small, they interface with the world in a really, really unique way. We had some previous episodes on how they interface with water, how when bacteria swim through water, it's kind of like if you were trying to swim through maple syrup or something like that. It's extremely difficult for them to get through that water because how large they are relative to the size of the water molecules. Similar type of deal when it comes to the air, right? The way that bacteria interface with the air, the impact that a gust of wind has on bacteria is way, way different than the impact that has on someone like you or I. And it's not just the way that they interface with the environment, it's how they can conduct themselves in the world, right? So, for example, if a bacteria is trying to infect a host, because bacteria are so small, they don't have the ability, just one bacteria isn't going to be enough. Like one bacteria can't just try and be virulent and then successfully destroy a host, right? It has to be a whole bunch of bacteria that are all working together in order to actually cause some kind of significant impact on a host because, again, the bacteria is really small and the host tends to be really, really big. Now, obviously, bacteria, because they're so ubiquitous in the world and because they are so effective at what they do, that indicates that they're not limited by the fact that they're so small, but in fact, they have the ability to work together and do these really incredible things, right? And a lot of research goes into discovering the ways that bacteria are able to coordinate what they do in an effort to negate or allow for the fact that they're super, super tiny, right? We've had episodes talking about quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is honestly probably the gold standard when we talk about, or the typical example when we talk about how small bacteria have to work together to do something really big. Quorum sensing, we talked about this, is when a whole bunch of bacteria, they're all releasing these little molecules as a way of figuring out just how many of their brothers and sisters are in a localized environment. And based on the amount of how many brothers and sisters are in that localized environment, they can coordinate their group behavior. Right, so there's a whole bunch of, in spite of the fact that bacteria are so tiny and they have to interact in these odd ways with the rest of the world, they have a bunch of different mechanisms by which they're able to coordinate their group behavior. Right, so that's very, very cool. That's our main first point. Now, we're going to do a real quick sidestep and talk a little bit about bacterial motility. Now, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of bacterial motility. We've talked about the flagella in the past, how they have like a little corkscrew thing that they use to kind of push their way through the water. They have these little kind of ways that they wave their flagella back and forth as a way of kind of like spinning around. We'll talk about that in a second. At some point, maybe we'll talk about the fact that bacteria walk on land and walk on glass and things like that, but that's a totally different episode. one of the most well-characterized phenotypes or mechanisms by which bacteria move is something called the swim and tumble phenotype, and it's exactly what you would think, I guess. So E. coli does this. Again, this is called the swim and tumble phenotype, and all that E. coli does is it has this period where it's doing a swimming phenotype, right? So if you envision E. coli, it's this little rod-shaped bacteria, and it has a little flagella corkscrew that sticks out behind it, right? And so then the corkscrew's spinning, and that's pushing the bacteria forward. Right? But sometimes the bacteria has to either stop or it has to change direction, right? And so what it'll do is it'll stick its flagella out in a different direction, right? And that'll cause, because they're moving along, it's kind of like if you stuck if you're swimming forward and then you stuck like a flipper out on the side, it rotates you. Right? It'll rotate you in the water or whatever medium that you're swimming in, right? And that's the tumble phenotype. So bacteria have this swim phenotype where they're moving in a particular direction, and then as a way of stopping or as a way of rotating themselves to move in a different direction, they have a tumble phenotype where the flagella sticks out in a different direction, not directly behind. So that's the typical way that E. coli, or one of the typical ways that E. coli is going to move around. Right? But there are some new ways, and again, this actually gets into the paper for today. There are folks who are trying to look at the movement of individual bacteria. So let's look at the paper here. So this one came out in November of 2024, so just a couple months ago. And this is out of the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Good job, Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And what these guys were doing, and when I read this, I was like, wait a minute, really? This is so cool. They built these things called microcavities. And all that a microcavity is you can picture it like a little circular container, right? And then what they did is they just took these individual bacteria and they put them in these little tiny circular microcavities, right? Locked them away, right? And then they were like, all right, bacteria, go ahead and move. Let's see what one bacteria by itself moves like. Now, the first thing that they noticed is that the individual bacteria, the way that they moved in these microcavities is they would move around. It's almost like the movement of a clock, right? You know how the clock goes like in this clockwise, right? So it just moves around in the circle in the exterior of a circle, in the circular motion on the exterior of the circle. That's essentially what a bacteria did. So it would attach to the circumference of the circle and then move around in a circular motion along the circumference of the circle, right? So that's kind of cool, right? Bacteria, they move in a little circle when they're by themselves. Right? The size of the circle, as it turned out, also was associated with the speed. So if you had a smaller circle or a larger circle, then the speed of the bacteria would change. Predictably, or presumably, that's due to the fact that there's maybe more water. Maybe there's a whole bunch of different factors that could go into that I actually don't know. But at any rate, so that was their initial pattern of movement. And then what the researchers did is they had an interesting thought. And they said to themselves, okay, what if we took two individual bacteria and we connected them together? So again, if we have these two microcavities now. They're both these little circular microcavities, but they're just connected by a little teeny tiny tunnel, a little teeny tiny passageway, like if you took the circles and put them right next to each other. So we have microcavity one circle, microcavity two, second circle. We put them really, really close together, and we draw a thin little tunnel between the two microcavities, right? So it's not big enough for a bacteria to get through, but there are some water molecules that can get through from one side to the other. Now, what was really, really wild, and I'll link the paper in the description like I always do, and if you have a chance, you should look at the videos that are associated with this. What's really, really wild is those two bacteria, they would move in those circles like we mentioned before. They would move in those circles, but then interestingly, after a couple rotations around the circumference of the circle, they would start to synchronize their movement. They would start to synchronize their movement to the point where the bacteria were essentially moving at the same rate and at the same position in their respective microcavities. Isn't that wild? So like if they each started at 3 o'clock, or let's say bacteria 1 starts at 1 o'clock, bacteria 2 starts at 4 o'clock, and then they start there and they continue that movement. And eventually they get to the point where it'd be almost as if those clocks were totally synced up. So they're both at 1 o'clock at the same time, at 4 o'clock at the same time, at 7 o'clock at the same time. And they continue this rotational movement at the same synchronized rate. It was so cool. And again, you should look at the videos in the paper that I link in the description, because it's really cool to see how they start off at asynchronous. They don't start off working at the same rate of movement. And then they, even though they're in separate microcavities, as soon as you link up those microcavities by just a teeny tiny tube, they're able to synchronize their movement and the rate of their movement. Now, why is this? Obviously, this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. It would make sense that bacteria are able to coordinate their movement with each other if they want to do something as a cohesive whole. How this happens, presumably the best explanation, as far as I can tell, is that there's an impact. It's impacted by the movement of water, right? So one bacteria, let's say it's swimming around, and as it swims around, it's impacting the water molecules that are then sensed or then impact the second bacteria. And then as that bacteria feels that push of the water, then it's like, oh, well, okay, we have another bacteria that's nearby that's moving at this rate, and so I'll synchronize my movement at that way. So it's almost like it'd be almost like if you have a whole bunch of fish that are connected. You know how schools of fish, they'll swim together cohesively. They use something other than what bacteria are using, but as an evolutionary benefit, they're cohering their style of movement. And this is a similar type of thing, presumably, for something like bacteria. So cool. Okay, so let's wrap this up, and then we'll get out of here. Number one, our first main point is that bacteria are extremely small organisms, and they have to come up with creative ways of dealing with the fact that they're so tiny. The second point is that bacteria have unique and cool ways of movement. We talked about the swim and tumble phenotype that we see in E. coli. We talked about how, and then our third point is from the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. They discovered that E. coli, if you put them in these little tiny circular microcavities, they'll swim around in a circle at the periphery, at the circumference of this little circular microcavity. And our final point, and this is such a cool point, is that when you connected microcavities, even just with a small, tiny little passageway, and you put two different E. coli in these two different microcavities, they would synchronize the way in which they swam. Really cool. Extremely interesting insight into the movement of bacteria and how they can cohere their movement and how connected they are, even if it's just by a tiny little tube. It opens up tons of other questions. Again, let's nail down how is it that these bacteria are able to sense and respond to the movement of their neighboring bacteria. What are some ways that we can use this maybe to manipulate the way the bacteria act in solution or in any given environment? So many different questions. But we'll have to turn to those questions later on for another episode. And until then, guys, thank you so much, every single one of you guys, for tuning in. And I hope I'll see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.